Hello, I want to welcome Lynn Godfrey, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Experience Officer for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. Welcome. Thank you for joining me, Lynn.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for coming. I want to just kick off the conversation by having you tell us a little bit about your career path that led you to the current role. I know you've been there at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society for a little over a year now. I think you started
Yeah,
just before the pandemic
that I
began.
did. An interesting
And,
time to
and
join an organization for sure.
absolutely. And I think you came to Leukemia and Lymphoma Society from the Girl Scouts.
Correct. Yeah, I was with the Girl Scouts of the USA for a little over 5 years, and then prior to that, the Red Cross of Greater New York, which is the largest chapter of Red Cross. I'm assuming that's still the case. And then in 2009, I started my nonprofit career, quite honestly, through a 4-year stint with the New York Public Housing Authority. But prior to that, many, many moons ago, I really spent the majority of my time in media, kids media, frankly, kids and family oriented
Hmm.
media. I began my career after college in advertising. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, even though I was pre-med. I realized, like so many people, I got to my senior year, I don't think I really want to go to medical school. What am I doing? So I took some time to think about what I wanted to do. Advertising, I always loved commercials, the creative process. Hey, let's try that. And so I went to join Young and Rubicam at a time when ad agencies were still on Madison Avenue. So I'm really dating myself. But after being there for 3 years and working on a lot of new product, a lot of consumer product goods, a lot of new product extensions or rollouts, where I got a lot of exposure to the brand marketers who are leading these efforts, I became interested in marketing overall. I didn't want to just focus on advertising. I really wanted to be involved in the whole picture. So I went to graduate school, Kellogg, and then after a short stint at Amex, started my career at Nickelodeon, MTV Networks. It was an exciting time to be there. Nick at that time was a little engine that could. We
Hmm.
were very scrappy. We had maybe one or two hits, and then over the course of 9 years, I think we, expanded into all these other lines of businesses, consumer products, movies, um, series, you name it. We had our fingers in everything. And then PBS Kids. So youth and families media. And it wasn't until 2008, 2009, where there was a major recession and I was taking a step back and thinking, like, what do I want to do next? And really felt it was important to do something that was connected to, had more of a purpose for me, I guess you could say, make an impact. And there was an opportunity at the New York Public Housing Authority, completely new to not only nonprofit for public. I mean, public housing is a mix of is a federal and local city state operation, and it was the last term of Mayor Bloomberg's tenure as mayor. And I think I often refer to those 4 years as sort of a PhD when it came to
Hmm.
uh, persuasion of navigating a very complex organization with multiple people who all have a stake in what you're doing internally and externally, and crisis management, that is for sure.
That's
And
that's
then,
that's a Sorry, I was
sorry.
gonna say that's an interesting progression. I was curious about that path from the for-profit world to the public service
Yeah.
world to the nonprofit world.
Yeah, it was, I taking a step back, it's not something I ever would have, I certainly didn't set out on that path. I think it's, when taking a step back, I think a couple of things fueled it. One is um, the connection to really my passion and interest in connecting to youth and families. And which you could certainly see if you think of Nickelodeon and then PBS Kids, et cetera. But what I found about public housing is that the majority of residents in public housing, they live at or slightly below the poverty line. A good portion, or at least a third of those residents, are single women, head of households, or seniors who are now taking care of their grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's more than just housing. You're dealing with issues of, yes, housing, but career development, education, mental health, and wellness, a whole host of factors that play into it. And it was a eye-opening experience, not only because for me, I saw firsthand the impact of people who are most vulnerable and oftentimes marginalized in their city or community, but in terms of how to reach them from a marketing perspective, it's not always the fancy, sophisticated apps or platforms that's going to get their attention. It could be as simple as a poster on the elevator door. It could be just as effective, or frankly, we now obviously refer to them as influencers. At the time I was there, that wasn't this marketing phrase, but it's really connecting in a grassroots level with people in the community who do have a lot of influence. They're sort of the unofficial mayors, or the people who
Right.
give advice and give credibility to efforts, and bringing them in early into whatever you were trying to accomplish was always really key to your success. So it really fueled my perspective on the different ways that you need to be thinking about how you engage and tell stories, and also being mindful not to forget or be dismissive of those people or communities who you might not think would be the ideal audiences for you, but in fact could be the most loyal and in many ways could benefit the most. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, it was quite something.
So, what advice do you wish that you'd gotten earlier in your career, or what advice would you give somebody that's maybe, younger and starting out in their career, that you wish you'd gotten?
Yeah, so there are two things I would say. One is embrace this idea of failure. I really think that when you're putting yourself in situations where you're stretching yourself and you're going out of your comfort zone, yes, you feel uncomfortable and awkward, and it may not work out, and then again, it will. But I guarantee you're going to learn something about yourself. You're going to draw on insights that you would have never had if you had stayed just within your comfort zone. So this idea of failing as just as important as success, I think, is very important to your journey along your career, because not everything is going to work out the way that you think it might. But I think those lessons are really important. And then the second is, and I learned this a little much later than I would have liked, but always take the meeting. If you get a call from, whether it be a headhunter or someone perhaps you used to work with, who's like, hey, I'm thinking of you about this opportunity, I want to talk to you about it, I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. You'd be really surprised about, I think you have to be open to what's possible. Case in point is New York Public Housing Authority. That was initiated by a phone call of someone who I had gone to school with, and I never would have thought of that as a path to pursue. But I met with them and as I learned more, I was really drawn in, and I thought, you know what, let me, I'm going to do this. I'm going to jump right in. So yeah, that's what I would say. Failure and take the meeting.
I love it. I love it. So I believe that everybody has a superpower, and I'm curious what you feel your superpower is.
That's a great question. So I think my superpower is figuring out the path to push an organization and or people on a journey to take on something or embrace something that they've never done before. And I attribute that, frankly, to my work at public housing, which was all about influence and bringing people along who were skeptical or wary or whatever you want to call it. And to me, as I embark, how I see that play out is as I embark on new initiatives, whether it's a new brand positioning or a campaign or investing in a resource that perhaps the organization hasn't, understanding who are those different groups of people who you need to bring along, whether they're in your department or outside the department or senior leadership, what have you. If you don't have that support and buy-in and understanding, then invariably it's going to fail, whatever the effort is. So I'm a big believer. I think that's my superpower, is identifying what is that path to get from A to Z and then working to make it happen.
Great. So I want to shift into kind of your role and leadership a little bit. I'm
Sure.
curious first, where do you find inspiration from a marketing perspective? Where do you look for inspiration?
Well, having been in the nonprofit space, I would say first and foremost, I always find inspiration from the people, the audiences that we're serving. For when I was at Girl Scouts, it was about the girls. That's our focus. How can we fuel their ambitions? Here at Leukemia Lymphoma, it's the patients who have just heard or in the process of being treated with one of the most deadly and challenging diseases that they'll ever face. I mean, there are 150 different types of blood cancers. Leukemia, lymphoma are two of the 150. It's a disease that is not, you cannot take preventative measures, unlike, let's say, breast cancer or colon cancer. You can take tests, examinations to catch it early. It doesn't operate like that. So it's very silent, and before you know it, it can catch up on you. And it's also a disease that impacts not just older adults, but it impacts youth. So as young as infants till early 20s. So it's devastating in many ways. And so the inspiration to really make sure people understand what we do, what we have to offer for patients, the research we're investing in, the legislative advocacy that we support, hearing the patient stories and meeting them and seeing their resiliency and courage and bravery is a huge inspiration. That aside, I am also really inspired, to be honest with you, from looking at what's happening in the art world. I just actually came from the Museum of Modern Art in the city over the weekend and went to an Alexander Calder exhibit. And
I love Calder.
Yeah, I'm always intrigued by artists, whether they're in whatever medium, and how they're taking a unique perspective on the world and they're creating something that has never been seen or done before. And I'm so intrigued by the mind that someone's perspective, you could think that way. And I love that, because in marketing, in my mind, it's all about how can you take, whether it's your product or service that people may have heard of and like, oh yeah, I know that, but you're trying to tell it or share it or talk about it in a way that comes from a different point of view. That's going to really draw people in. So I get a lot of inspiration from that.
Love it. So we're in the midst of this pandemic and hopefully see the light at the end of the tunnel, where there's a day where it's behind us as people are getting vaccinated and such. But outside of the pandemic challenges, what's the biggest challenge you face, or what's something that's happened that's kept this interesting a year later into the job?
Oh my gosh. It's hard to separate the impact of the pandemic from challenges, because it's clearly turned the world upside down. I think the biggest challenge is how can you, as leading a marketing team, keep people motivated in the midst of all this upheaval and be prepared for being uncomfortable. That's a word. I mean, I use this expression a lot. We have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And it takes practice, like anything. So, because who knows what the next 6 months will bring in terms of people's, I don't know, spending habits, or in our case, the people's feelings about charitable giving, even though we're in the health space. Are people going to be exhausted by because they've been in lockdown and focused on binge streaming services and binging content? Are they going to be now wary of content? Do they want more grassroots level interaction? I think we have to be prepared to be nimble and be able to pivot depending on what we see the dynamics occurring with the groups of audiences that we're trying to engage with. So being comfortable with being uncomfortable and using that, fueling that to get people to be thinking differently so that you can pivot and try to the extent you can, forecast or at least preempt what changes may occur to the extent you can.
Mm-hmm. So talking just a little bit, pivoting a little to leadership, what are some of the values that are important to you as leader, or what values are you looking for in people on your team?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, well, connection to mission, that's always super important for, again, being in a nonprofit organization. I think you genuinely have to feel that connection to the impact that we make and what we're focused on. I think this curiosity about, yes, and how do these things work, and trying to get up underneath, insights, research, trends, making sure you're taking in what's happening outside of the organization, meaning in the broader space. You're not insular, you're motivated by what other organizations and brands are doing. Collaboration is super important, especially as we're working via virtual. And empathy is important, not just in terms of putting yourself in the shoes, again, of the audiences that we're reaching, namely patients and their families. And then we have healthcare providers, a whole complex group of constituents we serve, but also empathy for your colleague, because people are dealing with working and schooling and everything else from their living room or kitchen or wherever they are, and they've been doing it for a year. I think it's important to be sensitive to what your colleague is, how they're doing and how they're faring. So yeah, and clearly skill set, and when thinking, and this year a bit, frankly, refashioning and have been building a team, what skill set, expertise are they bringing in? How are we expanding capacity? All of that.
I love it. You mentioned a bunch of values that are also actually part of our core values for my company. So I appreciate that. Curiosity is a key one, and connectedness and collaboration is another key one for us. So speaking of which, we're essentially matchmakers and connect brands and marketing agencies together. We also connect marketers in other ways. But I'm curious how you work with marketing agencies. Do you work with marketing agencies? And if so, kind of how do you work with them today?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So we've had a limited history, so to speak, with marketing agencies. We want an area that I use LLS. We use LLS as shorthand for Leukemia Lymphoma Society because it's a mouthful. So for LLS, we've set ourselves apart in the nonprofit arena through our peer-to-peer fundraising. Our major campaigns like the Night Team in Training are just have set a high bar. And so in that sense, we've worked with marketing agencies to really create an experience. So it's not just about, yes, we're asking people to volunteer their time to fundraise on our behalf, but there's also something more than motivates a person to spend their time doing that. It's a connection to the mission, but I think it's also that sense of community and camaraderie they get joining with others. And that's about an experience. So we've had a lot of success in working with agencies to help create that experience. But over the past year, when everything had to move virtual, as opposed to now the in-person experience, we had to try to replicate that in a virtual platform. And we've been able, obviously we've been figuring out as we go. So we've been working with an agency or agencies to help replicate that experience in a virtual sense. So that's the extent to which we have worked with marketing agencies. And I don't know, I think that may in fact be the case. We'll see how things progress as we go forward, where we've been starting to make a huge investment in development of content and finding the platforms and partners that we can develop really compelling content, like so many other organizations, again, that help us tell our story, or that our patients or volunteer stories, because they're the most compelling for sure. And so that may result in working with an agency, or I'll tell you quite honestly, we've had a lot of success of working with boutique groups or consultants. I mean, there's so much great talent out there. And being a nonprofit, a lot of times versus a traditional for-profit brand, you don't typically have as many resources. You're not going to spend as much in paid media advertising. And so it is really important for me, for our team, to work with partners who are ready to lock arms with us, again, connected to the mission. And I'm doing this because I believe in what you're doing. And if that means that you're smaller, or you've had agency experience, but now you're going off on your own, I frankly, as long as we're checking off the boxes in terms of pushing us to be bold and innovative, connecting to our mission, great storyteller, you bring a set of expertise or that we don't have in-house, then I'm game to work with you.
You mentioned content creation as one area where maybe you might use agency support to help you create, as you want to create more and more better quality content. Are there certain disciplines of marketing that you would never, ever, ever outsource to a partner like an agency, and certain ones that you would always outsource because you just don't think you should own them in-house?
That's a good question. An area of marketing that we would not outsource is the development of, not independent from the fundraising experience. Like, how do we deliver on that experience for peer-to-peer fund for volunteer? Is the marketing to bring in our patients. So that mission, anything that's mission specific. The reason why we would do that in-house is there's so much complexity to those relationships. We have an amazing mission team that, we invest in patient services and support, everything from how do you navigate your insurance form to connecting you to clinical trials. As you can imagine, there's so much emotion and level of support that patients need. That's not something from a marketing that level of understanding of those dynamics it's very hard to try to bring an outside party up to speed in all those dynamics. So I feel that that's something that we need to keep close to ourselves, given all those complexities, patients, their families, healthcare providers. Even within healthcare providers, there are many different segments within them. So that we would keep in-house. Externally, though, certainly partners who are helping us develop compelling creative. How do we make our brand, tell our story in a way that maintains our relevancy now and going forward? How can we bring attention to the terrific impact that we as an organization make in terms of research innovation? Those are areas that is super important, I think, to get outside perspectives on, for sure. And then, as I said, some of the content, we're doing some content internally, but I really think for us to truly optimize that area, we are going to need to work with an outside partner as well.
I'm very familiar with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society Man of the Year, Woman of the Year programs, because I've had several friends who have participated and
oh, okay, great,
contributed to help their success in raising money. But I'm wondering if there's like a specific program or a campaign or something. I mean, you've been there a little over a year, so it could either be from your time now at LLS, or it could be from even a previous gig. But is there a campaign that you're proud of, or that you maybe learned a lot from?
Oh, that's a good question. I I think in terms of LLS, shortly in my tenure, I started the end of January, and then by March, we were in shutdown, lockdown.
Yeah.
And we started hearing from our research, our patient resource center, started hearing from patients who were saying, I don't have enough financial resources to get to my hospital treatment. I was just furloughed. I don't have, I'm concerned about my shopping bill, et cetera. And so we needed to stand up. The decision was made to stand up a financial aid program for blood cancer patients, matching our dollars that we had along with various partners. And we had to put together an effort to make the patients aware of that the program and service was out there and get it out there. And so that was a quick, in my mind, that was a true test of how nimble the team could be to pull together all the various elements and touch points, not just in our own channels like social and web, et cetera, but also importantly, a lot of outreach to healthcare providers, to grassroots organizations that support cancer patients, specifically patients who don't have as many financial resources. And so I learned a lot about the dynamics or the challenges, frankly, that patients encounter beyond the diagnosis. The diagnosis is the beginning of what is this long journey. And so much of what they're contending with is more than just the medical treatment itself. It's also every aspect of their life. And in that sense, it reminded me of my time at public housing as well. Housing is, yes, an issue, but there's so many other factors that impact it. So I would say I learned a lot about the organization with the different team members being someone new and having to do this virtually. I jumped right into it. So, and at the end of the day, super proud because in the 2 months that we had the fund open, we reached around 15,000 patients with financial support. I mean, that's the biggest win for us. Is were we able to exhaust the fund? Yes, we were. Always looking to get more, but we exhausted it and we reached the number of patients that we felt that we needed to reach, and so in a short period of time. So that one's down.
Lynn, for anybody that questions the nobility of marketing, I talk sometimes about the nobility of marketing. I mean, some people think of marketing as tricks to get people to buy stuff they don't want to buy or something, but the reality is marketing can serve a real purpose to help people learn about the things that they need and want.
Yes.
And to your point, this is something that your community really needed, but without marketing, you wouldn't be able to tell that story to get that message out to them about this being available to them.
That's exactly right. So in that sense, there's a great sense of, as you can imagine, great sense of satisfaction and reward that you have saying, this social campaign or this direct mail effort or email effort, what have you, you can truly track the impact in a way that brings that sense of reward and satisfaction. That not to make light of people who are selling soap or whatever TV shows, which I used to do. That brings its own level of satisfaction as well. But for me, it at this point where I am, it's super important. So that was
I have a good friend who spent many years in the commercial marketing space and then moved to a large nonprofit. And he said that he wanted to use his powers for good instead of evil. So you can take what you want from that, but
it's true. Yeah.
But there is something super rewarding, I think, for knowing that the purpose of your marketing aligns with the purpose of a larger mission beyond just selling stuff.
Right. Yeah, and obviously clearly it's a very personal decision. There are a good number of people in the organization who personally have been impacted by cancer. Either they're survivors, or they have a family member or survivor, or they have a good friend or what have you. And so that's part of the reason that drew them to the organization. So it's just another layer of how you're able to sustain and build this commitment or creativity and innovation, because you know what's at risk if you don't, potentially.
Yep.
Meaning if your efforts are not successful. So
Right. Well, it can be life-changing, which is amazing.
yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask you some light, fun questions
All
to kind of
right.
wrap
I'm
things
game
up.
for light and fun.
So the first is just, is there a quote or a book or a movie or a show or a band that inspires you?
So this is going to seem so random. Well, first of all, I'm a big movie buff. I love movies. I love story, all different genres of movies. And there's a line I often refer to, that is from The Untouchables,
Hmm.
that I think came out in the 90s. Young Kevin Costner was in it, and Sean Connery was in it. And he plays this rough, gruff police captain or whatever. And he uses his line like, "What are you prepared to do?" And he uses it to challenge people, like, "You've done this, this, and this. Okay, so now what? You've reached an obstacle. What are you prepared to do? What are you going to do about it if you feel so strongly about this?" And so that is a line that inspires me, and I use it quite a bit with members of my team,
Hmm.
because there's always going to be some roadblock. Things are not necessarily going to work out the way you want to work. I mean, the way you would like them to. But if this effort or whatever you're focused on is so critically important, what are you prepared to do to try to? There's always an option. In other words, it may not be the most
Hmm.
ideal option, but doing nothing, in my mind, which is an option, by the way, doing
Yeah.
nothing, to me, that's not the option. What is the option, and what are you prepared to do? Obviously, in a way, without breaking any laws or things like that.
Right.
But that line from that movie has really struck a chord, and I think of it often, and I use it quite a bit.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's almost like a how badly do you want it question. You know, if
Yeah,
you want it
yeah.
badly, you'll do what you need to do to make it happen.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
Where
right.
do you find joy outside of work?
Well, as I said, I'm a big movie person, although I haven't been able to go to a movie theater. And I love everything about going to the movies, going to the movie theater, getting the popcorn, the whole thing. I mean, obviously I've been streaming everything, and that's great, but it's still not the same.
Yeah.
Um, I would say I going to museums. I
Mm,
mentioned that. I find that I really enjoy, um, and it's not just art museums, but I'm really fueled by learning about different things, or seeing how people's minds work in different ways. And then the other piece I would say is I am a huge fan of like home interior design and decor. So my biggest release is probably sitting outside with my House Beautiful or House and Home magazine, and I think that that's all about creating welcoming experiences and spaces, and putting elements together that you normally wouldn't think would go, but they do, and they create
mm.
this this feeling. So I enjoy that.
So if you weren't a marketer, you might have been an interior designer.
Well, I don't know if I probably want to pursue it, or the idea of renovating houses.
Hmm.
That aspect of it I enjoy, like going into a space that just looks rough and tumble, and trying and imagining and seeing the possibilities, and then making it happen. So yeah, I think so.
Okay, I got two. Well, let's see. So this one is there a brand that you've never worked on that you admire, and why do you admire it?
I would say the one that comes to mind is Patagonia.
Mm,
Um, they clearly make amazing products that are high performance, and cater to. They know who their audience is, and they create products that suit their audience. But I've been so impressed with their stance on social issues, and their willingness to go beyond putting out a pithy statement on social media, but actually making business decisions and taking
mm.
actions that align with their point of view. And I think we're at a point now where in general, the public is expecting that of brands. What do you stand for? Yes, it's great you make this great product, but at the end of the day, what is it that you represent, whatever that is? And for some, I think Panagonia is one that just has figured that out in a way that's quite credible and authentic to who they are.
Hmm. Well, I think to your point, we're looking for our brands to have a soul, not
Yeah,
just
yeah,
not just be surface level, but also have a larger mission in the world.
absolutely. That's exactly right.
All right, so I have a fun one for you. Which fictional story or realm would you live in if you could live in another realm or story?
Um, okay, so I'm gonna pick from one of the shows that I totally binged over the past year, and that is The Real Place with Ted Danson
The
and
Good Place.
I'm sorry, what did I say? The Real Place. The Good
Yes, The
Place.
Good Place.
Sorry, The Good Place with Ted Danson and Kristen Bell. I love that show. I love, and I think it speaks to this idea of learning, curiosity. To me, that show is all about how can you better yourself. Human
Mm,
beings are flawed, of course, but your journey, or if you so choose it, is to see how you can make progress. How can you learn more, do better, be better? And that's why I'm so intrigued by that.
it's a great, great show. Okay,
Yeah.
my last question for you is there something that I didn't ask you that I should have asked?
Oh, that is a good question. Should have asked me a question. I, I mean, I don't know.
That's
Um,
okay.
I don't think I think you covered good territory. I
All
don't
right.
know.
Totally fair.
I'm good.
All right. Sounds good. I never, a long time ago learned in an interview, when interviewing somebody, you can kind of ask, is there something I should have asked? And sometimes you get really interesting stuff from that. So,
That's
figured
true.
no reason to not throw it in the end.
Yeah. No, I think I no, I'm no, I think it's, well, maybe it's, and perhaps you've asked it in a different way, which is, this time we've gone through, it's been unprecedented. And perhaps the question is something like, what do you see for the future? Or, I'm excited to obviously facing a pandemic and all the families and people who have been affected, that is not anything to be excited about. Obviously, there's been a lot of despair and pain and hurt and sorrow. But in terms of, for a marketer, I think it's an exciting time for you to take a step back and truly think about revisit how you're going about doing things, and
Hmm.
think about that your brand, I'm not saying do a whole upheaval, but think about your brand purpose. Think about, is your team organized, or do they have the tools and support they need to truly flourish in the mix, in this time of upheaval? And I think when we do get back to quote unquote work, that dynamic, whatever that is going to look completely different than it did before. And so
Absolutely.
I think that as a leader of a team, I think that's going to be very challenging. How do you support people who, whether they're in the office physically or remotely and everything in between, how are you going to keep that communication going, excitement and motivation for what you do going, collaboration going? All of those things will be even more difficult, but I'm excited to take it on. And so
We're entering a new phase of reality of the world
yeah,
that we're going to have a new world in some ways, and in some ways it'll be better, in some ways it'll be worse, but it'll certainly be interesting either way.
that is for sure. It will not be dull.